Greetings. This message is being brought to you from a peninsula. There's a lot of water around either side, and then also a lot of lakes and ponds and so on here too, rivers. Now, for those children of you, children out there, I have a riddle for you. Why are fish so smart? Because they swim in schools. Hope you enjoyed that little riddle. I want to talk to you today about what some very significant prophets in terms of material, prophets who produce quite a bit of written material, what several prophets had to say about the Sabbath. I'm going to focus on 5 people who were given that gift of prophecy and were identified in the Bible as prophets. But I'm coming from all 3 sections of the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. The law, the prophets and the writings, the hagiographa, the holy writings. I'm going to go through all those sections and talk about what prophets had to say about the Sabbath. First of all, let's see what Jesus Christ had to say about the Sabbath. The Sabbath, of course, is a very important part of the life of a Christian. It's the 4th commandment, and there's a lot of meaning in the Sabbath, which if I have some time, I'll try to cover some of that today. But Jesus Christ gave us an example of not being overly legalistic about the Sabbath, as the Pharisees had become. The Pharisees had been really concerned about the problem Israel had in the past with violating the Sabbath, but they went overboard in terms of the do's and the don'ts and made it a problem. And so Jesus Christ wanted to have the balance, the proper balance in Sabbath observance. And so in Mark 2 and verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was made for human beings, and not man for the Sabbath. So obviously, it's like other things. We sometimes say, you eat to live, you don't live to eat. So in other words, eating is a part of life, but not an obsession. And even with work, you work to support the family and yourself and to improve humanity, but you don't necessarily live to work. There's other things you live for, and above all, you live for the goal of God's kingdom. So the Sabbath too, the Sabbath was given to human beings, and we are to keep it, but not in such a way as to make it a burden. And he goes on to say, therefore, because the Sabbath was created for human beings, the Son of Man, the human being who is the perfect human being, right, the representative of the human race, who created the human race, right? Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So this Sabbath really is his day, the Lord's day, the weekly Sabbath. And he showed us that we are to observe it, but not in a fanatical way. I grew up with Orthodox Jewish traditions, which were quite complicated. Orthodox Jews learn to live with them and enjoy the Sabbath, even with all of the restrictions. But it would be a lot more popular among Jews to be Sabbath keepers if it were not so complicated. I think many Jews decided with all the complications that they would just throw out the baby with the bathwater and not and that's too bad, because many more Jews, I think, would observe the Sabbath if they hadn't been told, don't turn on a light and don't heat up don't heat up a cup of tea, or etc., etc. And we may get to some of that later on. But let's just summarize. Of course, the book of the 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch, are the books of Moses, and the Genesis account begins with the Sabbath. We have 6 days of creation. God rests on the Sabbath. He sanctifies it in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Then you have in the account of Noah, periods of time of 7 days. You have the week established at the time of Noah. Then you have the 4th commandment in the Bible, where in the book of Exodus, where we acknowledge God as Creator, keeping the Sabbath. Then in Deuteronomy, Moses repeats it, and we recognize God as our liberator. Also, Moses, while in the wilderness with the children of Israel, before they received the Ten Commandments, before the fourth commandment was there written in stone, they were already trained regarding the Sabbath by the falling of the manna. The manna fell 6 days. They got a double portion on Friday. There was none on the Sabbath. Normally, it would be rotten if you kept it overnight. But that wasn't the case with the Friday portion. There was a double portion, and that which was left over did not rot because they did eat it on the Sabbath. And so they learned what day was the Sabbath before they ever came to Mount Sinai. Perhaps that's one reason why it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. They already knew, which day it was. So all of that, of course, is from Moses, who was a prophet. He spoke, he is the one through whom the original Sabbath commandment is given. But now we have 3 prophets that are major prophets. That is to say, their books are very long. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And each of them spoke about the Sabbath. I first want to go to the book of Isaiah and to the 56th chapter. I want to go to verse 3. Well, no, I'll go even earlier. Thus says the Eternal, keep justice and do righteousness. This is Isaiah 56. For my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who lays hold on it, who keeps from defiling the Sabbath, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. So God's way of life is so important. We need one day to focus on it, 1 day out of 7, to get back on track spiritually. It's that important. It's a very important part of the culture of God's people. And in fact, in the book of Leviticus, again going back to Moses, we are warned what would happen, or the people of Israel were warned what would happen by not keeping the Sabbath. Now in Exodus 31, the Sabbath is a sign of God's covenant with Israel. Not only is it the fourth commandment, but it is also utilized as a sign in Exodus 31. It's a sign of the covenant because it's something that people can notice. Here is a group of people, and Saturday, whatever we call it in whatever language we speak, but that's the day that is their day of rest, their day of worship. And so it's a sign of the covenant. And of course, it would therefore be a sign in that sense of the new covenant, because it's one of the 10 commandments. And what's the purpose of the new covenant? To have us obey God's commandment from an inner desire to do so, to have a deeper understanding of his commandments and a greater desire to fulfill them. The new covenant, having God's Spirit. But in Leviticus 26, God warns his people, you shall not make idols for yourselves, neither a carved image nor sacred pillars shall you rear up for yourselves, nor shall you set up an engraved stone in your land to bow down to it. So we're not to be idolatrous. Our worship should not involve idolatry. For I am the eternal your God. Verse 2, you shall keep my Sabbaths. It's plural there. There could be 2 ways to understand that. The Sabbath comes week to week, so we should keep God's Sabbaths. But another way to understand it is that there are also annual days of rest, so perhaps they're included in this. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary, for I am the Eternal. So we have that command there in Leviticus 26. So we see that at that time they were warned about what the standards ought to be, and you will see if you read the chapter, they would be greatly blessed if they stayed on that track, on that path, but they would be greatly cursed if not. And unfortunately, they didn't, and they were cursed. However, when they returned from captivity, at the time of, after they'd been there for a while, Nehemiah was there, and he was governing them, and he noticed that they were getting lax once again with that, unfortunately in many ways, but that was one particular issue that he had with them in Nehemiah 13. And if you look at the 13th chapter, he was very concerned with the fact that in the past they had been punished for not keeping the Sabbath, and he made sure that they would keep it under his authority. And at that time, the leaders of the Jewish people in the land of Israel had authority to enforce the Sabbath in that part of the world. They were a part of the Persian Empire. They had to send tribute to what is today Iran, but they had local autonomy, and they could enforce the Sinaitic covenant, including the Sabbath. However, as I already told you, because of the concern for violating the Sabbath, the Pharisees went way overboard and made it very, very complex. And some of you would be really surprised if you studied all of the complex do's and don'ts regarding the Sabbath that many millions of Jews observe today, even today. But I want to go back now to Isaiah 56 and verse 3. Do not let the son of the foreigner who has joined himself to the Eternal speak, saying, the Eternal has utterly separated me from his people. Nor let the eunuch say, here I am, a dry tree. So here are people who either are not part of the people of Israel because they're outside of the covenant, or they may be within, but they're unable to have offspring. For thus says the Eternal, to the eunuchs who keep the Sabbaths, and choose what pleases me, and hold fast my covenant, even to them I will give in my house, and within my walls, a place and a name, better than that of sons and daughters, eternal life for them, with all that implies as well. Eternal life as sons and daughters of God. Okay, be better than sons and let's start again in verse 5. Even to them I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than that of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And he goes on to say also the sons of the foreigner. It's possible for somebody who isn't a part of the covenant, it would have been possible in ancient times to have become part of the covenant by making that commitment, accepting the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, as the Jews put it. And then, of course, a male would need to be circumcised, and we would have then, and the male and female, the custom developed of immersion, baptism as well. And so that brought them into the covenant. However, the New Testament reveals that a Gentile in New Testament time, New Covenant times, doesn't need to be under the Old Covenant. He doesn't have to have access, or she, to the sacrificial system. Jesus Christ is our sacrifice. So circumcision is not necessary for Gentiles. They don't need to have access to the sacrificial system. Jesus Christ is their sacrifice. But let me read on here in verse 6. Also the sons of the foreigner who joined themselves to the Eternal to serve him and to love the name of the Eternal and to be his servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in the house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And that is so ultimately you see God's intent to, in fact, gather all people together under his law, his way of life. And of course, we understand when we come to New Covenant times, when we have the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, then Gentiles are able to come in under the sacrifice of Christ without necessarily be worrying about the details of the sacrificial system under the Old Covenant. So, but when they do, they of course will be keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments, and I've already showed you how important it was throughout the Bible, and how Jesus Christ clarified how to keep it. And there are various passages in the New Testament where he clarified how to keep it. And you know, when the Israelites were in the Sinai for 40 years, they didn't circumcise their children at that time, but they still were required to keep the Sabbath. In fact, it was a capital offense to violate the Sabbath when they were in the wilderness. I want to go now to Isaiah 58 and verse 13. Here it says, "If you turn your foot away from the if you turn your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight." We have in the Jewish community the tradition of the Oneg Shabbat, the delight of Sabbath. And we have gatherings where we eat and we sing and we have instruction. In some cases, folk dancing is included and so on. Oneg Shabbat. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Eternal, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways. We have 6 days a week to do, in effect, our thing, but on the Sabbath we should be concerned more with with God's things. Make sure we've prayed, make sure we've studied, and have been part of a it's a convocation. So we want to be part of a convocation. We want to be interacting with brothers and sisters in Christ and hearing instruction. And we want to be also resting. Use the day as a day of rest. Maybe you need a little bit of extra rest. So that's the time, the time to do it. The holy day of the Eternal, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking words. That's all it says. Speaking a word. It means, I would say, don't speak a word that would be inappropriate for the Sabbath. You have your business dealings and the various concerns of the week that you have to deal with, and the time to discuss them is during the week. On the Sabbath, put them aside. It reminds me of what the Hawaiians used to say. I'll have to sadly say I've never been to Hawaii, and I'm in a way without excuse because I lived on the West Coast for many years and then never got around to visiting Hawaii. But anyway, I've been told that when you visit Hawaii, they say, "We welcome you here, but leave your cares on the mainland." So that's in effect what the Sabbath is all about. Leave your concerns for the 6 days of the week and enjoy the Sabbath. Nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking words. Then you shall delight yourself in the Eternal, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. So there's a great reward for a person who regularly keeps the Sabbath, you see. It's a very positive aspect of Christian living. I'm going to read verse 14 without interrupting myself. I have a habit of interrupting myself. Then you shall delight yourself in the Eternal, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Eternal has spoken. Now, yes, Jacob was the father of Israel, but, in the New Covenant, we are called Jews spiritually in Romans 2, the Israel of God in Galatians 6. Galatians 3 talks about those who are in Christ become Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. I want to go now to Ezekiel. Let's go to Jeremiah. And here Jeremiah also spoke later, as his people were about to be taken into captivity. He also warned them about the Sabbath and having respect for the Sabbath. Let's go to verse 21. I might want to go a little back, a little ways. I want to go to verse 19. This is Jeremiah 17:19. Thus the Eternal said to me, "Go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, to which the kings of Judah come in, and by which they go out, and in all the gates of Jerusalem, and say to them, Hear the word of the Eternal, you kings of Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who enter by these gates." Here is the capital of Judah, one time the capital of the United Nations. Very important city, obviously, the future capital of the world. Thus says the Eternal, "Take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it by the gates of Jerusalem." Now, as I said, the Pharisees went overboard with this, and so when I was an Orthodox Jew, I could not put a key to my home in my pants and my trousers as I walked to services. And so many Orthodox Jews make a tie bar out of a key, so they wear it They can't carry it, but they can wear it as a tie bar. And that just shows how strict we were. Now, in many, many cities, Jews have constructed a kind of barrier. I think it all has to be is like a string that can go around an area. And I think much of New York City has this sort of a string or wiring that goes around, and it's called an eruv, and it means that everything within that area is now considered a private domain, and one can carry in that area, and so many, you'd be surprised, maybe even your neighborhood, if you live in a big city in US or Canada or the UK, maybe even your city has much of the city of some wiring around it so that Orthodox Jews can carry within there. But anyway, but here it's talking about a burden. So obviously we don't want to do the kind of work on the Sabbath we did during the week, unloading and unloading, moving, unloading your van and, that sort of thing, going to the dock, unloading the ships on the dock and loading the ships for exporting products, that sort of thing, right? Let me just go back to verse 21. Thus says the Eternal, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it by the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they did not obey, nor incline their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction. So it's a serious problem. If a person knows about the Sabbath, has an awareness of it, an understanding of it, and then chooses to ignore that, to violate it, it's not a simple matter. Obviously, it's a rather grave matter. And it shall be, if you heed me carefully, says the Eternal, to bring no burden through the gates of the city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day, to do no work on it. Then look at the reward. Then shall enter the gates of this city kings and princes, sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, accompanied by the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain forever. And I won't go any further, but I want to go on to another prophet, Ezekiel. Jeremiah was a prophet and priest, and Ezekiel, Moses, of course, was a Levite, but a prophet, and Isaiah, of course, was a prophet, and now I've gone to Jeremiah, who was a priest and a prophet, and he had a younger contemporary, Ezekiel, who was a priest and a prophet, and he had to be an exile himself. He was among the exiles of Judah, and in exile he heard about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. He got this news while in exile. But he had a very powerful impact on his people, as did Jeremiah, as did Daniel, who I'm going to talk about later. And so the captivity of Judah back then was only 70 years. And then they returned. And as I said, under Nehemiah, the Sabbath was strictly enforced. Under the scribes and Pharisees, it was too strictly enforced. And so Jesus brought the balance in his ministry. So now I go to Ezekiel 20, and I want to talk about the Sabbath in Ezekiel 20. I think it's around verse. Oh, here we go. Where am I going to pick it up? Let's pick it up verse 10. Okay, Ezekiel 20:10. Therefore I made them go out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. And as you know, he brought them there to sort of separate them out from the culture that they had known, and to reprogram them. And he gave them his law, and he made of them a nation. And then not long afterwards, they would have entered the promised land. Unfortunately, because of their bad attitude, which I talked about recently, I think in the Flair Church, the morning church where I speak, I talked about the fact they had 40 years in the wilderness. But anyway, he is their liberator, and the Sabbath pictures him as the liberator. And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live in them. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Eternal who sanctifies them. So we're set apart by our keeping of the Sabbath and, frankly, by the annual days of rest. And yet the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, that they despised my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live in them. And they greatly defiled my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my fury on them in the wilderness to consume them. Now he didn't, but they did have 40 years of wandering, and only their children then could come into the land. But I acted for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned by before the Gentiles, in whose sight I had brought them out. I'm now in verse 16. So I also raised my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments, and did not walk in my statutes, but profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. Nonetheless, my eye spared them from destruction. I did not make an end of them in the wilderness. But I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, nor observe their judgments, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am the eternal your God. Walk in my statutes, keep my judgments and do them. Hallow my Sabbaths. This is verse 20. And they will be a sign between me and you, as I talked about in alluding to Exodus 31, that you may know that I am the eternal your God. Notwithstanding, the children of Israel rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes, and were not careful to observe my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. But they profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said I would pour out my fury on them, and fulfill my anger against them in the wilderness. Therefore I withdrew my hand and acted for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the Gentiles, in whose sight I had brought them out. There's quite a bit here, but I think you get the point that he was very upset with them, and one reason he was upset with them is that they just never did get around to properly respecting the Sabbath. It's one of the problems that they had. He did interact with them. He punished them, but he did allow them to enter the land, and Joshua did lead them across the Jordan, and for a time they generally did obey under Joshua and under the elders. But then we had the judges period, and then you can read the rest of the story, But I'll stop here with what Ezekiel had to say. But I do want to remind you that if you read the Bible, not only do you have the law, a lot is said about the Sabbath there, including prophecy relating to the Sabbath, but now you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of them really stressing the importance of the Sabbath as part of a whole way of life. We don't want to just take one commandment and kind of build some kind of decorative I'm trying to think of the word, some kind of fence around it. There are other commandments we have to be concerned with. We have to be concerned with how we treat other people, obviously, and the Sabbath is part of that too, because an employer, he rests on the Sabbath, and his employees rest on the Sabbath, and even his livestock, rest on the Sabbath if he's a farmer, but we have, honoring parents, and there's a lot to God's way of life, and it's all good. It's all to make us better people, to make the world a better place, and the Sabbath is a part of that. Now Daniel is in the writings, but Daniel is a prophet. He's called a prophet in Matthew 24, for example, by Jesus Christ. But if you look at the Jewish Old Testament, we have the law, the prophets, and the writings, and Daniel, although a prophet, is in the writing section. Just like Moses, a prophet, he's the giver of the law. Daniel was a secular ruler under the kings of the Chaldean Empire and then the Medo-Persian Empire. He played a secular role, and he's in the writings that are the books about kings, about David and Solomon, and even Job evidently was a king in Edom. And so we have Daniel, who was second in command of the just like Joseph was earlier in history. He never could be the ruler, but he was almost second in command there. So in any case, I want to talk about Daniel and just say this. If you go to the 9th chapter of Daniel, it's a very famous prophecy. Almost all of you have heard a lot about it, because there's a lot of speculation about it. We're beginning in verse 24, and I'll just turn there very briefly. Daniel 9, and it goes, the 24th verse, I think, is where we want to start. It could begin earlier, the intro to it, and then it finishes in verse 27. And how is it organized? Here is a prophecy which talks of the first coming of Christ and the second coming, and there's a lot of speculation about all the details that are here. And there's other information you get from this prophecy if you study it in the Masoretic text. The translation in front of you, most of you are using a Bible translation which is using the Septuagint version of that prophecy, and that's fine. The Greek-speaking Jews in Christ's day were aware of it, and that kind of helped jumpstart the church. But Daniel 9 is not quoted in the New Testament. The Masoretic version is different and isn't as obvious as the Septuagint version, and both ought to be studied. But anyway, the point I'm bringing out today is it talks of 70 weeks. So the whole prophecy is organized in terms of a day for a year. The principle you find in Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6. It's organized in the principle of a day for a year, and we have weeks of years. 70 weeks, or 490 years. And in fact, along with the weekly Sabbath, there is a sabbatical year in the Bible. There is a year of land rest, and then there's 7 of them in a cycle, 49 years, the 50th being the Jubilee. Just as you have 7 Sabbaths, you begin with the wave sheaf offering, and you count 7 weeks, and then you have the 50th day being Pentecost. So even Daniel, in effect, is implying the Sabbath. So with all of that background, you could understand why New Testament Christians would obviously want to continue to obey the 4th commandment and to keep the Sabbath. Not in a fanatical way, as Colossians tells us. We have to focus on the fact that Jesus Christ ought to be the center of the Sabbath. And I want to conclude by showing you that when we keep the Sabbath, in fact, we do remember our relationship to God through Jesus Christ. Sabbath is a day of rest, and we have spiritual rest, mental rest, emotional rest when we are part of the family of God, when we are brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. I want to go to Matthew 11, and in Matthew 11 and verse 28. Okay, Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So these 5 prophets that I've talked about today, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, these 5 prophets that spoke about the Sabbath. In effect, when we keep it from week to week as Christians, we're reminded of the rest we have in Jesus Christ, who also, of course, kept the Sabbath, who commanded the Sabbath in the first place, as far as that's concerned. Anyway, let's go further. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Yes, it is an obligation. It is a yoke, but it's a yoke which leads us on the path to eternity. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When we, in the Jewish community, towards the end of the Sabbath, we would gather around a table in the synagogue area, and we would have a third meal together. We would sing, we would discuss spiritual matters, we would have instruction. This was called the Sudah Shlishit, the third meal. And we would talk about the Shabbat as Me'en Olam Haba, a glimpse of the world to come. And so as Christians, we keep the Sabbath. It reminds us of a time of rest for the world. And it reminds us of the rest that we are yet to receive. Remember in Psalm 95, the Israelites were told, as I said earlier, you're not going to enter into my rest. It was the next generation. And so Hebrews 3 and 4 speaks about that. It warns us. We don't want to be like those rebellious children of Israel who were denied the rest that came to the next generation. We don't want to be denied that rest. And so in Hebrews 4 and verse 9, it says, there remains therefore a rest, sabbatismos, in the Greek. There remains the keeping of the Sabbath, the keeping of a Sabbath for the people of God. We're looking forward to that rest that's out there, that promise of God. And as we keep the Sabbath from week to week, it reminds us of our future in the kingdom of God. So you can understand why these 5 prophets earnestly exhorted God's people concerning the Sabbath. And we should, of course, appreciate it, and we should also, of course, observe it as Christians under the new covenant. All the best to you and yours.